This is not the version that the story told, but the version it has tried to hide.
This move was something Hannibal never saw coming, not even in his dreams. The Roman heavy infantry first moved the wounded to the rear, while the light infantry cleared the enemy corpses to the side. Then, they formed a crescent-shaped formation, with the veterans positioned on both flanks of the crescent, followed by the seasoned soldiers and then the new recruits arranged inward in sequence. Because the veterans had extensive combat experience, they were better equipped to carry out the flanking maneuvers on both sides. Once Scipio had finished adjusting his formation, the Numidian cavalry, having routed the Carthaginian cavalry, also returned to the battlefield. Thus, the scene on the plains of Zama mirrored what had happened 14 years earlier on the plains of Cannae, only this time the roles were reversed. Hannibal could only watch helplessly as his personal guards were slaughtered one after another, with 15,000 of his soldiers being completely wiped out at Zama. In the Battle of Zama, more than 20,000 Carthaginians were killed, over 20,000 were captured, and the remaining survivors fled back to the Carthaginian capital. Hannibal managed to escape to Hadramedum with only a handful of cavalry, while on the Roman side, only 1,500 men were lost. With his decisive victory at Zama, Scipio secured a complete triumph, and Rome began its path to dominance over the Mediterranean world. In ancient wars, there was no right or wrong. History was always written by the victors. As human civilization progressed, at some point people began to distinguish between just and unjust wars, though of course there are exceptions. For example, even today the Japanese still do not consider war to be a crime. In their eyes, there are only winners and losers, with no distinction between justice and injustice. If we judge Rome through the eyes of modern civilized people, I believe no one would fail to praise Rome before the Second Punic War. The Second Punic War lasted a total of 16 years, during which Rome lost over 100,000 soldiers, and more than 10 consuls and generals were killed in action. At that time, Rome was practically the embodiment of justice. Even when dealing with Carthage, which had inflicted heavy wounds upon them, they only imposed symbolic punishments. However, after the Second Punic War, Rome gradually embarked on the path of imperialism, and criticism of Rome became increasingly frequent. The Roman Senate had a system called the princeps, a position held by the most authoritative among the 300 senators. From 200 BC to 183 BC, Scipio, who defeated Hannibal, was Rome's princeps. After the Battle of Zama, Scipio was respectfully called Africanus by the people, meaning the conqueror of Africa. However, before this conqueror of Africa could enjoy the glory brought by victory, Rome was once again at war, this time with Macedonia on the Greek peninsula. Greek city-states, led by Athens, appealed to Rome for aid, claiming Macedonia's king believed himself a reincarnation of Alexander and wanted to march south to annex the Greek peninsula. Macedonia had previously tried to form an alliance with Hannibal to attack Rome together, but Rome skillfully thwarted this plan. Now, with Macedonia turning against the Greek city-states that had once helped it, Rome certainly would not tolerate Macedonia's actions. In 197 BC, Rome and Macedonia fought a battle. Rome had a force of 20,000 men, of which only half came from Rome and its allies, while the other half were soldiers from various Greek city-states. Macedonia, on the other hand, had 26,000 troops. However, the outcome of the battle shocked the entire Mediterranean. Macedonia lost 8,000 men in battle and 5,000 were taken prisoner, while the Roman side suffered fewer than 700 casualties. King Philip V of Macedonia was completely stunned. He hadn't expected such a huge gap between himself and Rome, so he immediately proposed peace talks. Rome accepted the peace talks, but the Greek city-states were unhappy. They argued that if Macedonia was let off so easily, it would give rise to another Hannibal, so Macedonia should be completely destroyed. Rome, however, countered by saying that if Macedonia were gone, who would defend against the Celts from the north? So leaving Macedonia a way out was also a means of safeguarding the security of the Greek peninsula. However, as one crisis settled, another arose. The Seleucid dynasty of Syria now threatened Rome. The Seleucid Empire is causing trouble again. Alexander once took just 10 short years to achieve dominance across Europe, Asia, and Africa. After his death, his vast empire was divided among his subordinates, giving rise to the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia, the Seleucid dynasty in Syria, and the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, as well as the smaller Pergamon dynasty. Along with Carthage, which had just been defeated, these countries were all major powers around the Mediterranean at the time. Now, both Carthage and Macedonia have already submitted, while Syria and Egypt have yet to face Rome. Because the city-states bordering Macedonia were very dissatisfied with Rome's leniency towards Macedonia, they incited Syria to send troops against Macedonia. And the reason Syria dared to send troops was because it held a trump card: Hannibal. After his defeat, Hannibal originally stayed in Carthage, but someone reported to Rome, accusing Hannibal of colluding with Syria and plotting something sinister. Rome sent people to investigate Hannibal, and when Hannibal realized his scheme had been exposed, he fled to Syria. Hannibal offered advice to the Syrian king Antiochus, suggesting that he first destroy Macedonia, then conquer the Greek peninsula, and, riding that momentum, land directly on the Italian peninsula to defeat Romulus, accomplishing a feat even Alexander the Great had not achieved. Of course, this plan sounds far-fetched, and there is no solid evidence to prove that Hannibal actually made such a suggestion. In any case, the Syrian king Antiochus was fully prepared to attack Greece. Eventually, Rome and Syria clashed at Thermopylae on the Greek peninsula. With only 500 cavalry left to protect him, King Antiochus fled by ship back to Asia Minor. But but the war was still not over. Rome needed to send its army into Asia and defeat Antiochus on Syrian territory for a complete victory. Rome considered this situation extremely serious, because Antiochus, determined to redeem his previous defeat, was assembling an army of over 80,000 men, while Rome could muster at most 30,000 troops at this time. As a result, they had no choice but to send their trump card, Scipio, to personally lead the expedition to Syria. However, Scipio had already exceptionally served 2 consecutive terms as consul, and it was impossible to make another exception. So the Senate appointed Scipio's elder brother, Lucius, as consul, with Scipio accompanying him as an advisor. Everyone was well aware that Lucius was a rather mediocre man, and that it was actually Scipio who was leading the army. And so, 9 years later, in 190 BC, Scipio was once again about to face his old rival Hannibal. Which was truly superior, the Roman legions or the Macedonian phalanx? Alexander once relied on the Macedonian phalanx to set out from the Greek peninsula in Europe, conquer Egypt and Africa, sweep through the Middle East and Asia, and even push all the way to India, never encountering a true rival along the way. Meanwhile, the Roman legions, backed by their powerful citizen-soldier system, became like indestructible cockroaches no matter how badly they lost. They always managed to achieve victory in the end. Now, the two sides are about to face off in a direct confrontation. Many years after the Battle of Zama, Hannibal and Scipio had an interesting conversation in Syria. Scipio asked Hannibal, "Who is the greatest general of this era?" Hannibal replied, "Of course, it's Alexander, king of Macedonia. He reached the distant east, a world beyond our imagination. So the only way to describe him is as great." Scipio then asked, "Who is the second greatest general?" Hannibal said, "It's Pyrrhus, king of Epirus. As a tactician, he is the best." Scipio continued, "Who is the third greatest general?" Hannibal replied without hesitation, "Without a doubt, that's me." Upon hearing this, Scipio smiled and then said, "If you had defeated me at the Battle of Zama, what would the ranking be then?" Hannibal said, "In that case, I would unquestionably be number 1, and both Alexander and Pyrrhus would have to step aside." Alexander and Pyrrhus both have to step aside. Do you agree with Hannibal's statement? If he had won the Battle of Zama, would he really have achieved even greater accomplishments than Alexander? In 190 BC, under Hannibal's instigation, Syria sought to annex Greece and then invade Rome. So Rome and Syria clashed in the Aegean Sea. It was Hannibal himself who commanded the Syrian fleet, but perhaps because he was not skilled in naval warfare, he lost once again to Scipio. At this point, the Syrian king Antiochus proposed peace talks, but Rome felt that the terms offered by Antiochus were too stingy, so the negotiations failed. Scipio led an allied force of 34,000 troops onto Asian soil, marching south along Asia Minor and advancing towards Syria. Antiochus assembled a large army of 60,000 to meet the attack, and thus the Roman legions faced off against the Macedonian phalanx. Both sides in this battle were commanded by second-rate tacticians. Scipio was unable to participate due to illness, and Antiochus did not have Hannibal lead the battle either. Even though the Roman forces were only half the size of the Syrian army, victory still belonged to Rome. This was because Scipio had learned Hannibal's tactics, flexibly changing formations and then encircling and annihilating the enemy from the flanks and rear. Moreover, Scipio further developed and popularized this tactic in Rome. At this time, the Seleucid dynasty of Syria was the heir to Alexander's legacy, so they used the Macedonian phalanx. The Macedonian phalanx was also known as the Hedgehog Legion. Once they raised their 7-meter-long spears, it was nearly impossible to defeat them from the front, but their flanks and rear were extremely vulnerable. When Alexander was alive, he used powerful cavalry to make up for this weakness. Unfortunately, Syria did not have strong cavalry, nor did it have a general like Alexander, so they were quickly defeated by the Roman legions. The Syrian army lost 33,000 men, while the Roman army suffered only 324 casualties. The Syrian king, Antiochus, unconditionally surrendered to Rome. After Carthage and Macedonia, yet another Mediterranean power, the Seleucid dynasty of Syria, also became an ally of Rome. Rome claimed that Hannibal, who was under Syrian protection, was a dangerous figure, and demanded that Antiochus extradite Hannibal to Rome. So Hannibal was once again forced to flee, this time escaping to the kingdom of Bithynia on the Black Sea coast. Scipio was aware of this, but he did not send anyone to pursue Hannibal. That's just how people are once someone becomes too outstanding. They attract jealousy. Especially since Scipio had held the top position in the Senate for many years. So as soon as he returned to Rome, he was accused. The person who brought the charges was a tribune of the people, but the mastermind behind it was none other than the famous Cato the Elder. Scipio, furious, lashed out at the members of the Senate, but as a result, the accusation turned into a trial against him, with all his past misdeeds from years ago being brought up again. Heartbroken, Scipio left Rome and began living a secluded life in his own villa. In 183 BC, Scipio Africanus died in his villa at Laternum at the age of 52. Scipio also refused to be buried within the territory of Rome, leaving a final message: "Ungrateful fatherland, what right do you have to possess my remains?" Coincidentally, in the same year, Hannibal also died on the shores of the Black Sea in Bithynia. A Roman captain, eager to earn merit, requested the king of Bithynia to extradite Hannibal to Rome. Upon hearing this news, Hannibal drank the poison he always kept with him. The unparalleled tactician who once threw Rome into chaos, and who would later be honored as the father of strategy, Hannibal, met his end at the age of 64. And so, the two main protagonists of the Second Punic War exited the stage of history at the same time, ushering Rome into a new era. This was a war of unimaginable brutality. Rome destroyed the world's first empire in just 7 days. Time destroyed Carthage, which had existed for 6 centuries. Inside the city of Carthage, no one was spared, regardless of age or gender. Whether it was city walls, temples, or ordinary houses, every building was demolished, and even their farmland was covered with salt. They even called upon the gods to curse this place. From then on, Carthage became a barren land where not a single blade of grass would grow. It's hard to imagine that what the Romans did to Carthage was actually out of jealousy. After losing to Rome in the Second Punic War, Carthage not only lost Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia, but also its navy. A people who had prospered through maritime trade were now forced to survive solely by farming. But what the Romans didn't expect was that the Carthaginians were also exceptionally good at farming, and their economy quickly revived. Cato of Rome consistently advocated for the complete destruction of Carthage. He once showed the Senate figs produced in Carthage, saying that an enemy capable of producing such abundant fruit was just 3 days' sail away from us. Cato was a master of rhetoric. In order to incite the Romans against Carthage, no matter what topic he discussed, he would always end with the phrase, "I think Carthage must be destroyed." Thanks to Cato's agitation, the Romans became even more worried that Carthage's revival would once again bring disaster to Rome. At this time, the kingdom of Numidia was frequently harassing Carthage, so Carthage recruited 60,000 mercenaries to teach Numidia a lesson. This, however, enraged Rome. After the Second Punic War, Rome had demanded that Carthage could not wage any war without Rome's permission, and moreover, Numidia was an ally of Rome. This was a blatant violation of the treaty by Carthage. Rome immediately dispatched 4 legions to Carthage. As a result, not only did Carthage fail to defeat Numidia, but it also attracted 4 Roman legions. In order to appease the anger of the Roman Senate, Carthage promised to immediately disband the mercenaries and execute the commanding officer who led the troops. However, Carthage was slow to fulfill these promises, causing Rome to completely lose trust in Carthage, and decide that both Roman consuls for the following year would be stationed in North Africa. This indicated that the main battlefield for the next year would be in North Africa. This was undoubtedly a declaration of war against Carthage. At this point, Carthage truly panicked and sent representatives to Rome to beg for mercy. But Carthage was truly unlucky, as Rome was currently dealing with the Greeks. Rome had already sent troops to the Greek peninsula twice, and had even destroyed Macedonia. Now, another person had emerged, claiming to be a descendant of the Macedonian royal family, inciting the Greek city-states to rise up and resist Rome. Rome was already furious at the Greeks for their repeated betrayals, and just at this moment Carthage came to beg for mercy. So the Roman Senate made an outrageous demand. The Carthaginians had to demolish their capital and relocate all residents to an inland area at least 15 kilometers from the coast. If they did not accept these terms, then they would have to prepare for war with Rome. Rome's unreasonable demands stirred up a sense of nationalism among the Carthaginians, and they rose up to resist Rome. The Carthaginian capital was turned into a weapons factory, and the disbanded mercenaries were recalled. Women cut off their hair to make ropes for slings, and the gap between rich and poor disappeared. All prisoners and slaves were freed to help defend the capital. Of course, Rome did not attack Carthage immediately. Rome declared war on Carthage in 149 BC, but the full-scale siege did not begin until 147 BC. During this period, Rome dealt with the rebels led by Macedonia. Among them, the Greek city-state of Corinth was destroyed because it had insulted a Roman senator. The city was completely destroyed, and all its inhabitants, regardless of age or gender, were sold into slavery. The only things left untouched were the works of art, which were all transported to Rome. After Athens and Sparta, Rome. After Sparta, Corinth, which had long been the 3rd most important city in Greece, vanished from the face of the earth. This was Rome's warning to all the defiant Greeks. From then on, under Roman hegemony, the Greeks became much more compliant. Next, it was Carthage's turn. From 149 BC to 147 BC, Carthage had already put up a fierce resistance against Rome's siege for 3 years. In the spring of 146 BC, the Senate issued an order to utterly destroy Carthage, just as they had done with Corinth. Thus, the Roman legions launched their final assault. The capital of Carthage was eventually breached, and street fighting broke out amidst a sea of flames. The Roman army searched house by house, advancing street by street. This street battle lasted for 6 days and 6 nights. Because they refused to surrender, as many as 50,000 Carthaginian citizens, including children, were forced into slavery. It was not until 100 years later, in the era of Caesar, that humans once again lived on this land. In its more than 600 years of history, Rome had never before attempted to completely wipe an enemy off the face of the earth. However, in 146 BC, both Corinth and Carthage were razed to the ground, and years later, Numantia in Spain suffered the same fate. Rome came to dominate the entire Mediterranean, and its acts of brutality became increasingly uncontrollable. We all know that ancient Rome was already a republic 2,500 years ago, but few people realize just how chaotic Rome was under this republican system. There was once a pair of brothers named Gracchus, who were devoted to improving the welfare of the common people, but their efforts ended up sparking a war between the poor and the rich. As a result, these two brothers were still young when the Senate threw them into the Tiber River to feed the turtles. The Gracchus brothers were born with silver spoons in their mouths. For 3 generations there wasn't a single coward in their family. Their grandfather was Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal, and their father was also quite famous. Back when Scipio Africanus was put on trial, it was the Gracchus brothers' father who stepped forward to defend him, which is why Scipio gave his daughter in marriage to their father. Moreover, this father and Scipio Africanus' daughter Cornelia had 12 children together, but in the end, only the Gracchus brothers and their sister, who married Scipio the Younger, survived. The Gracchus brothers' mother was also remarkable. Their mother Cornelia was regarded as an idol for all Roman women, on par with Caesar's mother Aurelia. Furthermore, the Gracchus brothers' brother-in-law was none other than Scipio the Younger. It was Scipio the Younger who won the Third Punic War and destroyed Carthage. Scipio the Younger was the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus. They both bore the name Scipio. To distinguish between them, later generations referred to the one who defeated Hannibal and won the Second Punic War as Scipio the Elder, and the one who destroyed Carthage and won the Third Punic War as Scipio the Younger. In 137 BC, this was during the reign of Emperor Wu of Han in China. In ancient Rome, at this time, the 26-year-old elder Gracchus was elected quaestor and sent to Spain to suppress a rebellion. As a result, the previously invincible Roman legion suffered a crushing defeat, and in the end, the responsibility of quelling the rebellion still fell to Scipio the Younger. Scipio the Younger found the regular Roman army to be too incompetent, so he formed his own legion to go to Spain and suppress the rebellion. At the same time, a slave uprising broke out in Sicily, and the regular Roman army was actually defeated by the slaves. What on earth has happened to the Roman legions that once dominated the Mediterranean? Gracchus the Elder discovered the reason. After defeating Hannibal, Rome took less than a decade to leap from being the small leader of the Roman League to becoming the hegemon of the entire Mediterranean. This outcome caused Rome's wealth to skyrocket, but the gap between rich and poor also widened dramatically. In Rome, citizens were classified into different ranks based on their property, and taxes were also levied according to the proportion of their wealth. Taxes were collected according to the proportion of one's property. After Rome became the dominant power in the Mediterranean, its sources of wealth increased, so it abolished taxes on its citizens. As a result, the group that benefited the most were the wealthy class. The rich invested their extra money in land, and then used slaves to cultivate it. However, the main force serving in the Roman military was the middle-class citizens. When these middle-class citizens returned from war, they found that their own farmland could not compete with that of the wealthy, and the crops they produced could not be sold. To make a living, they had no choice but to borrow money from the rich. In the end, with interest piling up, they were unable to repay their loans, and even had to give up their last remaining land to the wealthy. A large number of middle-class citizens became proletarians. Proletarians were those who didn't even own any land, essentially, the poorest of the poor. In ancient Rome, proletarians were not required to serve in the military, so when wars broke out, there were not enough people to fill the ranks. At that point, Rome had no choice but to conscript the proletarians and pay them wages. The proletarians, who didn't even own any land, fought only for their wages. They no longer had the spirit to fight desperately to defend their own land as before, which led to a sharp decline in the combat effectiveness of the Roman legions. Gracchus, the elder brother, recognized this reality and wanted to save these proletarians. In 134 BC, at the age of 29, Gracchus the Elder was elected as tribune of the plebs. The tribune of the plebs represents the broad masses of the people and can stand up to the entire Senate. As soon as Gracchus the Elder took office, he introduced several bills. The main content was to limit the amount of land that the wealthy could lease, reclaim any excess land, and then release it to the proletarians. He also provided them with startup capital. At this time, the king of Pergamon in Asia Minor passed away. Before his death, the king requested that the kingdom of Pergamon become a Roman province. As a Roman province, they would not be required to serve in the military, but they would have to pay taxes. Gracchus the Elder planned to use the taxes paid by the kingdom of Pergamon to subsidize the proletarians. Originally, after finishing his term as tribune of the plebs at the age of 29, Gracchus the Elder could have naturally entered the Senate at the age of 30. However, in order to implement his land reform bill, he applied for re-election as tribune of the plebs. The Senate absolutely would not allow Gracchus the Elder to be re-elected as tribune. So at the election site for the next tribune, a massive brawl broke out between the faction of commoners and proletarians supporting Gracchus and the wealthy faction led by the Senate. Gracchus and his supporters were armed with wooden sticks, while the Senate side used iron rods, so Gracchus was no match for the Senate. While trying to escape, Gracchus was caught and beaten to death. That day, including Gracchus and his supporters, a total of 300 people were beaten to death. All of these more than 300 bodies were thrown into the Tiber River to feed the turtles. This kind of tragedy was the first time in the 400-year history of the Roman Republic, but it would not be the last. Because next, it would be Gracchus's younger brother's turn to be thrown to the turtles. This is the most tragic pair of brothers I have ever seen. The elder brother, as a Roman tribune, stood up for the poor, but ended up being beaten to death by the Senate and the wealthy. In order to quell the anger of the poor, the Senate adopted a series of appeasement measures. First, they exiled several wealthy individuals who had led the incident. Second, they announced that the land law issued by Gracchus's elder brother would remain in effect. Then, they appointed Gracchus's younger brother to be responsible for advancing the bill. But at this time, the younger brother was just a young man in his early 20s. During the Roman Republic, only those over 30 years old were allowed to hold public office, so Gracchus's younger brother was unable to make much of a stir. Fortunately, the land law enacted by his elder brother during his lifetime proved highly effective, significantly increasing the number of middle-class citizens who formed the backbone of Rome, and the city enjoyed several years of peace and prosperity as a result. Scipio Aemilianus, who was in charge of suppressing the rebellion of the native Spaniards, also achieved a great victory. He captured the rebel stronghold of Numantia and treated it just as he had treated Carthage. The implementation of a Carthage-like layered strategy took place, and the slave uprising in Sicily in 132 BC was also completely suppressed. However, people tend to forget the pain once the wounds have healed. Since the chaos had subsided, there was no longer a need for so many people to serve in the military, so the Senate stopped supporting the land reform laws. The gap between the rich and the poor began to widen rapidly again. After Tiberius Gracchus was killed in 133 BC, his younger brother kept a low profile and stayed out of the spotlight until 124 BC. At this time in China, it was the era of Emperor Wu of Han, and General Wei Qing was chasing the Xiongnu all over the map. In Rome, the younger Gracchus brother turned 30 and was elected tribune of the people. After his election, he was no longer low-key. He began proposing a series of bills, starting with reviving the land law his older brother enacted during his lifetime. Then, he himself introduced a grain law, which required the state to purchase a certain amount of wheat and then sell it to the vast number of poor people at half the market price. After that, he proposed several more laws, including the military law, public works law, and colonial city law. Whether it was military service, employment, or the national economy, he sought to provide comprehensive benefits for the poor. The younger brother also advocated for the establishment of colonial cities in important locations, including the recently destroyed Carthage. Rome's practice of building colonial cities had a significant impact on later generations. Many modern European cities have been confirmed through research to have developed on the foundations of ancient Roman colonial cities. Gracchus's younger brother also proposed an even more radical jury reform law. Previously, all members of the jury were drawn from the Senate. Now, all members of the Senate were kicked out of the jury, but that wasn't the end of it. Gracchus's younger brother then proposed an even more radical reform of citizenship rights. Citizenship was an even more sensitive issue, because it concerned the interests of all Roman citizens. After Rome became the hegemon of the Mediterranean, Roman citizenship became highly coveted. Even high-ranking senators like Scipio Minor dared not touch this issue. Yet Gracchus's younger brother, not knowing his own limits, boldly attempted to reform citizenship rights. He wanted to bring in more outsiders to become Roman citizens, but with only one cake to go around, the more people there are to share it, the smaller each person's slice becomes. Moreover, Gracchus's younger brother even managed to get re-elected as tribune. So the Senate had to find a way to get rid of this thorn in their side. Thus, they launched a two-pronged attack against him. First, they smeared and slandered him, claiming that all of his reforms were just to win votes, and that he wanted to concentrate all power in his own hands. Second, they set up a puppet tribune to oppose him. This man was named Livius. He also proposed countless bills, and they were even more radical than those of Gracchus's younger brother. The Senate passed all these bills, but had no intention whatsoever of actually implementing them. The sole purpose of this was to bring down Gracchus's brother. Eventually, the younger brother failed in his third bid for the tribuneship, but the story did not end there. Although he could no longer serve as tribune, he still had a considerable number of supporters. The two sides continued to clash, and in the end, Gracchus's younger brother was charged with treason. The Senate sent troops to suppress them, and in the end, as many as 3,000 people were killed along with Gracchus's younger brother. Just like Gracchus's elder brother, their bodies were thrown into the Tiber River to feed the fish. All the efforts made by the Gracchus brothers were swept away with the waters of the Tiber. Later generations summarized the reasons for the failure of the Gracchus brothers' reforms. Their vision was simply too far ahead of their time. Most people only care about the present, so if reforms go beyond the general public's level of understanding, it is not easy for them to succeed. A scholar once said that pioneers without the backing of force are unlikely to escape the fate of failure. The Gracchus brothers are case in point, and 70 years later, so was Caesar.
Subscribe to Animystika, not to miss anything. Like and share, and join me right away for a new trip in history.